And now I'm calling for Gwyn Daniel from Healing to Survival is the topic, Gaza's mental health crisis amid genocide.
Thank you, distinguished jury panel, for allowing me to speak about this really important topic. Can I just check that people can hear me? Okay. So my name is Gwyn Daniel, and I'm a systemic family psychotherapist who lives in the UK and who has worked for many years, okay, thank you, with colleagues in Gaza. How do we understand mental health in the context of a genocide, an ongoing genocide? One of the criteria for genocide is causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group. The mental harm is one that we all know about. It radiates out of the epicenter of murder and destruction, but it sometimes receives less attention, even though every single witness here bears testimony to the suffering and the extremes that people are subjected to. In this presentation, I want to share some principles for understanding and responding to the mental health crisis in Gaza, to speak about some of the components of the genocide and their psychological impacts, and then to discuss what are the minimum requirements for any recovery. And I just want to say that my talk is profoundly informed by my colleagues of the Palestine Trauma Center and the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, whom I've met with regularly and have learnt from them all the extremes of suffering that they and their families have been subjected to. So what is an ethical approach to mental health? The effect of 2 years of genocide on the mental health of the population of Gaza is incalculable. We have to be very modest in even trying to assess the impact of it. We have to be humiliation. Humility is a really important part of how we think about the extremes of suffering. As my Palestinian colleagues always comment, there is no post-trauma. Trauma is continuous and ongoing and has been for generations. So while many individually focused interventions for trauma may be helpful, the only ethical responses to collective trauma on this scale are those which address decades of political violence and the need for self-determination and liberation. And that means supporting interventions which embrace activism and modes of resistance. It means speaking about impacts, but it also means speaking about responses. And it means supporting those mental health practitioners already operating in Gaza, have been operating throughout the course of the genocide. Mental health workers have been continuing to work with children, families, in the same way that the doctors of Gaza have never given up on their duties. It means foregrounding the cultural norms, the collective values and the aspirations of Palestinians themselves, and being extremely wary of Western models of therapeutic intervention developed in those very countries that are complicit in the genocide. As mental health practitioners, we endorse the principles of the Gaza Solidarity Health Declaration, which many physicians here have signed, and which apply to medical as well as physical illness. So, just to say a couple of things about the traumatic impact of 2 years of virtually continuous bombardment, killing, mutilation, overkilling, as many of my colleagues have described it, of living in a death zone, of the feelings of numbness, shock, people describing feeling they are already dead or longing to be among the dead. No time to grieve because survival and protection of the living is paramount. So grief can remain frozen. Unfreezing, expressing all the grief and pain of loss, is something that can only be determined by the people affected. It cannot be determined by outside professionals. The destruction of the infrastructure, the laying waste to homes, hospitals, schools and mosques, does not only constitute physical destruction, it aims at the heart and soul of the community, its collective consciousness and its systems of mutual support. This has profound impacts on mental health, as indeed it is intended to. Just as religious institutions nourish collective spiritual consciousness, schools and universities nourish hopes and dreams for the future. Their destruction deliberately acts to crush such hopes, but recovery from trauma crucially requires the recovery of the sense of a future. Mass displacement. It is much, much more than being forced to move multiple times. It is a reactivation of the trauma of the Nakba. It means living in a traumatic past, a traumatic present, and the anticipation of a traumatic future. It means the shattering of attachments, profound attachments to homes, belongings, and neighborhood. It involves the separation of families, either through displacement within Gaza or families who have left and have had to leave beloved family members behind. And the constant forced displacement does another thing which depletes any sense of acting with agency. It leads to a profound sense of powerlessness. People cannot even take control, as in any other war zone, by leaving because they are not allowed to leave. Gaza is unique, I think, in the only being one of the very few areas where people are imprisoned within the war zone. We've heard about mass starvation, and I will just highlight a couple of aspects of the psychological impacts of mass starvation. And they include the profound impact, as our colleagues have spoken, of parents feeling guilt, shame, and helplessness at not being able to feed their starving children and witnessing them crying with hunger. This has the potential to profoundly disrupt the relationship between parent and child, and likewise for mothers who are too malnourished to breastfeed, they are deprived of that precious bonding with their children that breastfeeding produces. I will say a few things about the impact on children. This has been described by UNICEF and others as a war on children. And we have to remember that in a settler colonial society, children are not intended to have a future. Children are a demographic threat rather than a resource to be celebrated. Nearly 40,000 children have lost one or both parents in this genocide. And within Gaza, children who are bereaved of a parent or both parents would normally be cared for by extended family. But of course, extended families too have been wiped out or are too debilitated to be able to fulfill this task. We know from studies of trauma on children that the exposure to constant states of fear, hyperarousal, will have permanent impacts on children's brains, because there are no contexts where children can calm and recover from those states of hyperarousal. We also know that the way to help children in those situations is the provision of a calm environment, a structure, a routine, such as we know schools, which are so enormously valued by the children of Gaza and their parents, can provide. So the reintroduction of schooling is going to be absolutely crucial. We also know that children have had to fulfill adult responsibilities, which for many of them have been unmanageable beyond their physical and psychological capacities. Looking after younger siblings, fetching food, fuel and water, helping elderly or disabled relatives. So to summarize, the mental health impacts in Gaza cannot be encapsulated by the conventional means of mapping rates of psychological symptoms displayed by individual members of a population. The impact on an entire population of being subjected to such immeasurable suffering requires a different approach. It needs to be understood in the wider context of a brutal onslaught on the very wellspring of collective life, with a deliberate aim of fragmenting the population and severing them from their homes and their land. Now, our knowledge of trauma includes understanding the basic conditions for recovery: safety, the restoration of agency over extreme powerlessness, accountability, restitution, and justice. None of these conditions exist, nor are even envisaged in the so-called peace plan. While the need is massive and overwhelming, interventions must include the resources of those mental health practitioners within Gaza to continue their work. They have provided services to families throughout the genocide, operating at great risk to themselves and operating crucially within the existing political structures of Gaza. They are thus exposed to all that is implied by that weasel word in the Gaza peace plan, de-radicalization. They are exposed to those risks. As the latest Gaza Community Mental Health Programme report concludes, Gaza, despite the pain, continues to pulse with life, and the Gaza Community Health Programme will remain a witness and a steadfast advocate to ensure that hope endures. It is the duty of all of us in the international community to remain alongside them. Thank you.